Good evening, everybody. Many thanks for joining us this evening for tonight's discussion. I'm just omitting one or two people. My name is Will, from the publisher of Bleeding for Jesus, Darton, Lomond and Todd. As people continue to log on, and I continue to admit people, we've got loads tonight, which is great. I'm just going to run through a few house rules for tonight. Firstly, please keep your audio muted at all times if you can. That will help the conversation along with Jeremy and Andrew. And secondly, the event is being recorded this evening. So if you don't wish to appear on screen, it's unlikely that you will, but if you don't, please turn off the video setting in Zoom. The two main participants and myself at the moment, but the two main participants, obviously Andrew and Jeremy, will be spotlighted during the discussion, but I mentioned the video thing just so that you're in the know. Just letting one or two people in. So the event will proceed as follows. There'll be a very short intro from me. Then I'll hand over to Jeremy to begin the discussion with Andrew. And at the end, Jeremy will be able to put some of your questions to Andrew. So while Jeremy and Andrew are talking, there'll be the opportunity to post your questions for the audience Q&A in the chat using the chat function. I'll demonstrate that in a moment. Please address them to me as the host, and I'll field them and forward them on to Jeremy to ask of Andrew when the time comes. And as I said, I'll indicate how to do that once we're underway. So you'll all get a little message on the right hand side of your screen telling you how to do that, and all you need to do is type in to the chat box and make sure you select me, the host, and yeah, I will field your question and pass it on. Okay, I think we're pretty much ready to go. So as said, my name's Will. I'm from the publisher Darton, Lomond and Todd. I imagine most, if not all of you joining the event are aware by now of the book, Andrew's book, Bleeding for Jesus. It's available in paperback from high street bookstores and also online, of course. Bleeding for Jesus is a comprehensive critique of the UN network, the abuses performed by John Smyth, and the impact it has had on British society, the church, and of course, the individuals involved. Throughout our involvement as the publisher with the project, we felt that the book represents an opportunity for the church as an institution and the UN network to reflect on what has happened, reflect on the victims of the abuse, and reflect on the culture that allowed the abuse to happen. And in short, we feel that this is a story that needs to be told, needed to be told and needs to be told, needs to be listened to, and that needs to be heeded. So without further ado, I am going to unspotlight my and hand over to Jeremy and Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Well, I mean, I've just finished reading the book, and I did that thing at first of reading it quickly about 3 months ago when Andrew made it available to me, and now I've read every word. And Andrew, I want to say, first of all, congratulations on what is an incredibly forensic work where no stone is left unturned. So I'm imagining it was a very hard book to write.
Yeah, it's taken a long time to do. I first became involved in this whole story quite by accident, six or more years ago now, and having kind of picked up the stone and looked under it and realized that nobody else seemed to be looking under it, I just felt I had to do it. I was enraged by the hypocrisy of this man. I was conscious that at the time he might still be abusing people, and as it turned out he was. And I was also conscious that the victims and survivors, of whom increasing numbers became apparent to me, had seen no kind of justice of any sort at all. So I just thought this has to be done. And so in a way, the book is a summary of work that I've been doing rather than the particular kind of driver for it.
The first time I became aware of the name of John Smyth was this report on Channel 4 News with the brilliant Kathy Newman, who I was half hoping she might even be in the crowd today on the call. But of course, the thing is, in a way, that was the end point for you, because the lead up had been quite a long time coming, hadn't it?
Yeah. The first thing that happened was that I got a call from an organisation called the Titus Trust way back in, I think it was 2014, saying that they had they'd had a disclosure of abuse, historic abuse in the Iwerne Camps network, and they thought that they were worried that this might become public, and would I be able to give them some help or advice, which is the sort of thing that occasionally I did for organisations. So to cut a long story short, I went and met with people from the Titus Trust, and they gave me information, and I went away and looked at it, and it very quickly became apparent to me that there was much more to this story than either they knew or they were telling me, and that it needed to be brought into the open. So I went back to the Titus Trust and I said, look, there's more here than you realise or have yet dealt with. What you need to do is you need to do three things. You need to have a full independent investigation into it, and then you need to take what's important to the police or the social services, and then you need to look at your current safeguarding practices, and then when you've done those things, I'll by all means I'll help you to tell the world what you've done. I thought they might go for that, but in fact what they said was, well, there's no way we're going to do that, so off you go. So I went off, but with this documentation, with this awareness, growing awareness of what had happened, thinking, oh, what do I do about this? I could perhaps have gone to the police, but they'd already taken some parts of it to the police, who hadn't been terribly interested because it was quite a long time ago, and there were questions for them about whether this was a consensual thing, and the guy was in South Africa, so very difficult to deal with. This was in the wake of Jimmy Savile, when the police were dealing with a lot of allegations of abuse. So the police weren't going to do anything. I realized I needed to go a lot further into this in order to bring it into the public. Well, I didn't have the resource to do that by myself. So I worked for a long period with Kathy Newman and the team at Channel 4 News, who were, I mean, I cannot praise them too much. They were excellent. They were pastoral and caring and forensic. And eventually, beginning of 2017, we were able to publish the story for the first time.
Take us back to the start, or as far back as we can go, because the book goes back before 82, when we had the first sort of proper memo. He was at it in these Iwerne camps, and yeah. What's the first time when you're aware of his offending?
It's still quite hard for us to know when he started. It would be sometime in the mid 1970s that John Smyth, who was a barrister, a QC, and a prominent Christian, and a kind of Christian rights campaigner, began to recruit young men in order to discipline them, in his terms, to initiate them into this kind of strange Christian discipleship program that involved beating them until they bled. That seems to have begun in the mid 1970s around Winchester College, and then it grew. And in spite of the fact that some parents and potentially people at Winchester College seem to have known about it in the late 1970s, it didn't really get uncovered until the beginning of 1982.
So, and Anne Lee has just sent a message saying, correcting me, that he wasn't doing it at, let's just change the phraseology here, he was not abusing young boys at the actual Iwerne camps. He was doing it in his home. So I obviously I truncated the story there slightly.
Yeah. Well, there is it's quite important to know that there's one instance that we know when
yes.
when he did abuse terribly a young man at or around one of the camps. But you're right in saying that most of the abuse in the early days certainly happened in his home in Winchester, in a garden shed which he had created and decked out in order to do this. But we also know that further down the line, he was assaulting people in Cambridge and various other parts of the country as well, attached to universities.
Now, I don't want to sort of upset anyone here, and I'm conscious that we've got at least one victim on the call, but your book goes into some detail about his means of assaulting people and also questions about what he was getting out of it. Just tell us as much as you can about that. Yeah,
his way of working with, if you put it like that, with young men was to recruit young Christians, many of whom were they were all at the very best of public schools, and almost without exception they were brought together through the Iwerne Camps network, and he would disciple them. Now, the individual discipling was part of the pattern of the Iwerne network. It was a year-round discipling, but he would do this very intensively, build up intimate relationships, and then at some point he would say to these young men, you know, if you really want to be committed to Jesus, what you need to do is to submit to being beaten. You know, he would say things like, God can't be your father on earth because God is your father in heaven, but I can be your father on earth, and I will deliver the discipline that you need. And so what he would do, to cut a long story short, is make appointments with these young men on a regular basis, sometimes weekly or fortnightly. They would come down to Winchester and they would be beaten with canes in his garden shed. First it might be 6 or 10 strokes of the cane, but by the time the relationships had developed, and he was sometimes beating the same young man hundreds of times until they I mean, they were damaged in so many ways. They were physically harmed. Many of them would bleed and have to hide their injuries, but obviously mentally, psychologically, they were deeply damaged, and some well, I was going to say some haven't recovered. I don't think anyone would recover from that level of trauma, and certainly for some it's become the dominant factor in their lives. Your book actually begins with the story of one of them. Yeah, very compassionately told. Just tell us a bit more about him. One of John Smyth's key victims was a lovely man called Andy Morse, who Smyth formed a relationship with, and it got into a pattern where he was being beaten every 2 or 3 weeks, scores of times, deeply damaged. And there came a point where it was Andy's 21st birthday was coming up, and John Smyth offered him a special beating to mark his birthday, his kind of entry into adulthood, and this was going to be the beating to end them all. And Andy couldn't face that, and felt the only way out was to take his own life. So that's what he attempted to do in his university halls. Fortunately, he was discovered by his flatmates and rescued, as it were, taken to hospital, but still couldn't really reveal what had happened to him, because Smyth would draw, like a lot of abusers, Smyth would draw people into kind of secret web where this is just between us. This is something that other people shouldn't know about. Fortunately, shortly after that, another person who had been assaulted in this way by Smyth chose to blow the whistle by going to his local parish priest in Cambridge and reporting it. And Andy's still with us.
I think someone's got their microphone on somewhere, by the way. There are two particular things that I think make your book brilliant. One of them is that you describe, and I'll come to this in a second, this man's legal career, which is the staggering hypocrisy. And then the other one, as Will's mentioned, is that you talk about what happened in Africa, which a lot of people might have thought, well, that was away, that was out of sight. So just first of all, and I didn't know this until I read the book, so I'm grateful to you for excavating all this. He was Mary Whitehouse's right-hand man. Tell us about that.
He was in the late 70s and the early 80s, which was a time of kind of moral angst and anger, and a time of LGBT activism and liberation. John Smyth was part of the kickback against that. He was part of the moral force alongside people like Mary Whitehouse and Malcolm Muggeridge, and he provided the legal services to Mary Whitehouse in a number of high-profile cases. He prosecuted Gay News and its editor Dennis Lemon for the publication of what he said was a blasphemous poem about Jesus on the cross. He later went on to prosecute the National Theatre for a play in which there was said to be a homosexual rape on stage, and he prosecuted
that was Romans in Britain, right? That was
Romans in Britain. That's right. Yeah. And he prosecuted the Independent Broadcasting Authority for not stopping the broadcast of a play called Scum. He was very active. He was the kind of moral crusader, and that's bizarre. I mentioned the hypocrisy of this thing was one of the things that really got to me, and it was the fact that Monday to Friday he could be working in the Old Bailey, in the High Court in London, prosecuting people, taking this high moral stand, and then going home at the weekends and engaging in this kind of naked beating, which is clearly homoerotic, sadistic. The sheer hypocrisy is extraordinary.
I think, wasn't it Oscar Wilde who said that a moralizer is one who lectures others against the sins of which he has grown tired?
Well,
which seems to sum him up.
Yeah.
So the second thing then in your book, which I thought was really extraordinary, was that you really properly describe what this criminal entity got up to when he was sent packing. We'll talk about why exactly the church thought it was a good idea to send him to another country in just a moment. But when he arrived in Zimbabwe, he just basically started up again.
Yeah, he did. He within 18 months of arriving in Zimbabwe, he'd started a camping network of his own that kind of paralleled the Iwerne Camps network, although this time he was working with young men from public schools, the Zimbabwean equivalent of Eton Harrow and so on. But this time he was recruiting younger children to the camps. So the children who came to those camps would have been aged 11, 12, 13, 14. And he changed his methods a bit in that he was beating people on the camps, and instead of in Africa, he made no pretense that this was anything to do with Christian discipleship. He said it was just fun. It was, although, you know, there are 90 of those young people were cited in a court case against him, where it was alleged, where grievous bodily harm was alleged against him. That court case never came to trial for various reasons. And also, you know, but I have affidavits from 5 of the young men who were beaten there, describing in very graphic terms what happened to them on the camps. The other thing that happened in Zimbabwe was that one young man called Guide Nyachuru, who was a 14-year-old Zimbabwean from just to the west of Harare, came to the camp, what would have been then the summer camp. It was in December in the Southern Hemisphere. and on the first night of the camp, or the first morning of the camp, was found drowned in the swimming pool at the camp. Now, we don't know, and we will never know quite what happened to Guide, although I've spoken to Guide's family and people who were eyewitnesses. We'll never quite know how Guide died. We do know that John Smyth then gave Guide's family a large amount of money, what he called comfort money, for them. And that remains an unexplained death. He was sent for trial for culpable homicide, but that trial was never completed. And Smyth jumped the border from Zimbabwe to South Africa before it came to conclusion.
I see on the back chat, the chat here, that Gillian's saying we've all read the book, we know what's in it. I don't think people have all read the book, and I think telling this story is really good. We will get into your question, Gillian, about where it's going from here, but let's just fill in the background here. It's really important, and it's been 10 years of Andrew's life. And I mean, I know this is kind of detailed, but I'm looking at this thinking, okay, now the Zimbabweans are onto him. And then somehow he managed to hobble the prosecutor by saying the guy wasn't impartial. He could get out of anything. Yeah.
I mean, he was a very, very smart guy. Yeah, you're right. He seemed to be able to get out of anything. In Zimbabwe, a whole group of really well-meaning and and smart pastors worked their socks off to try and close him down, but didn't manage to do so. And he bullied them fiercely. I've spoken to some of the pastors who were in Bulawayo, where they were collecting at the time, and he said, one of them said, when John Smyth came round to visit you, you knew you'd been visited. He came round really threatening, if you close me down, not only will you be going against the work of God, but I'll see you in court. So he was a bully.
The absolute hinge point of the story is 1982, isn't it? It's where everything aggregates in the UK and everyone sees exactly who this man is. And I want you to take us through why the police weren't called in, why the church didn't get busy, what went wrong at that point.
In 1982, some brave young victims who were at Cambridge University went and reported this to their parish priest, and he in turn spoke to the leaders of the Iwerne Camps network, and he wrote, is a guy called Mark Ruston. He wrote a report, a very comprehensive report, which is printed in full in the book. He went and investigated what had happened and interviewed 13 of the men, realized that there were around 20 young men who he could identify who had been attacked in this way, knew that it was a criminal act. There was no doubt about that. And Mark Ruston handed this report to representatives of the Iwerne Trust. They then met together, of which John Smyth was the chair at the time. He wasn't the chair at the time, he just stood down as chair. They then had to decide what to do, and to cut a very long story short, what they tried to do was first to close down his activity. They demanded that he leave the trust. In fact, he resigned before they did that. And they then, over the next 3 years, during which he was still operating as a lawyer and appearing on kind of ethics programs on television, but during those 3 years, they persuaded him that he needed to get out of the country, and he went to Zimbabwe. He told people, he tried to get a number of jobs in the UK, but people from the Iwerne Trust, wherever he went, people were warned off. But people being warned off in very general and gentlemanly terms, if you like. You ought to know that he's not a good chap. He's not one of us. So really, don't give him a job. He went and studied for a year part-time at Trinity College, Bristol, and then eventually picked up and moved. He didn't even tell his family why they were moving to Zimbabwe. They believed that he was going following a call of God, but in fact, of course, he was being that move to Zimbabwe was engineered for him. A job was found for him in a Christian organization in Zimbabwe. One of the things that horrifies me, I barely need to say this, but it's the idea that it's okay to export your abusers to another country because what? Because Zimbabwean children don't count the same? I don't know. It's an awful thought.
Do you, when you wrote this bit, and as I say, it seemed to me reading your book that 1982 was the sort of pivot point in the story when it needed one good person to stand up and say no, and they weren't there. Could you sort of understand how that had happened? Because that was the time, and that's what you did. You sort of dropped the trash over your neighbour's fence.
Do you know what, Jeremy? The abuse happens in all sorts of communities. We know it happens in football clubs, in sports groups. We know that it happens in school groups. We know that it happens in all sorts of communities where there's a kind of power structure, an imbalance of power. You would just expect the church, you'd expect Christian people to deal with it differently. And I don't think that's even a matter of, that was then and this is now. You would just expect Christian people, Christian leaders, to deal with this differently. And there were a large number who knew. 20, 30, 40 Christian leaders knew back then what was going on. And many of those people have known and talked about it. It's been dinner party conversation around that network for the following 20, 30 years.
There's a question here from Chris Rees, which is really good, which is, can you give us a bit more detail about these so-called bash camps, bash because of Eric Nash, and the wider evangelical subculture, including Jonathan Fletcher and the Nobody's Friends clique? There we are. That's the question. Have fun with that.
It's a huge thing, but the Iwerne Camps network, sometimes known as Bash, after the person who founded them, whose name was the Reverend Nash. The Iwerne Camps network started way back in the 1930s and grew and developed. It brought together, it was a discipleship network. The aim was to collect young men, and it was always men for the first 40 years or so, young men from the very best schools, always kind of elite select boarding schools, and train them up in a particular model of Christian discipleship. And it was done through an intensive one-to-one mentoring. Every young man would be given a mentor who would check up, read the Bible with them, check up on their prayer life, check up on their sex life, make sure that they were kind of on the straight and narrow. And when you were in, and it was a friendship group and a network that gave you your identity. If you varied from it in the slightest, you were likely to be dropped altogether. And there were approved Iwerne churches as well. If you were at Cambridge University, there's a particular church you would go to. If you were at Oxford, there's another church you would go to. If you were in London, and there are this network continues. It doesn't go by the name of Iwerne, and in fact the organization that's taken the camps over has now dropped the Iwerne tag because I think it's probably too toxic for them. But the network, in a sense, continues. The exclusive churches with a very particular brand of Christianity, extremely well financed, and it's a loud network within the Church of England to this day. It's a loud voice.
before we went sort of into the full group, you introduced me to somebody who's on the call just anonymously, who is a victim of John Smyth. I don't know if that person, if you want to say more about that person who's here, that we can't see him, or whether he would like to speak.
Yeah, Graham has joined us. If you read the book, you will have come across Graham. That's not his real name, but he is one of those victims of John Smyth who I really honour for their courage in wanting to pursue this. I'm just a bloke with a pen, really. Graham and the other victims are those who have, some of the victims have wanted to deal with this. So, I mean, Graham, I think he's probably unmuted and may have things to say.
I am unmuted. I'm always asked, why did I come forward in 2012? And it was a time when there was awareness of Jimmy Savile. There was a book about Trevor Huddleston, and it had been on my mind for 30 years. It had been bubbling away. And there just came a point when I thought, I know something that people should just know. And where is this man, and what is he up to now? Depressingly, that was in February, will be 10 years ago that I came forward. And we still don't know what actually happened, apart from Andrew's book. And still no one has been held to account. But I wrote to the diocese.
Just to jump in, Jeremy, you said that there was a hinge point in 1982. I would say there was another hinge point in 2013 when Graham came forward to the Church of England. Sorry, Graham.
Yeah, I mean, I came forward in 2012, but it took a year to get into the Church of England proper and to get to Lambeth and to get to the nascent National Safeguarding Team. But I wanted to know what Smyth was up to, and I have given evidence to the Macon inquiry of the 8 times I wrote to the Diocese of Ely saying, have you heard from Cape Town? Has he been shut down? I wrote again and again and again, and I was told repeatedly, we can't get hold of anyone, no idea where he is. And it took another 5 years for the story to break on Channel 4, and 5 years later, we're still waiting for the Macon inquiry and the various other reviews. And despite the fact that Justin Welby, almost exactly 6 months ago, said that there would be an investigation into everyone who had known for 30 years, no one is suspended, no one's under investigation that we're aware of. Goodness knows when the Macon review will be out. It is 10 years since I came forward, and we're only now having this discussion.
What were you at the Iwerne Camps then, Graham? I
attended the Iwerne Camps for about 5 years and was at one of the universities involved. I probably knew 18 out of the 25 odd victims that there were.
And so you've seen the damage in their lives?
Yes, not just their lives.
Your life too?
Yeah. Yes, and it has been a struggle for the last 5 years, for the last 10 years. But one of our complaints constantly is that victims have to make all the running without us chasing, without us kicking, without us asking questions, without us pushing for things. Things would just not happen. I drove for 5.5 hours down to see the Bishop in charge of safeguarding and said the Church of England have got to do a review and have got to investigate this. And I was horrified to learn that the National Safeguarding Team didn't even have a file open on Smyth. And it was only really through a year of constant badgering that I think they reluctantly agreed to do a review. They just weren't going to touch it.
And as I understand it, the official line is, well, Iwerne wasn't Church of England and he wasn't a vicar. Is that right?
Oh, I passed to NST some time ago the list of the 58 clergy who were at Iwerne or subsequently got ordained in 1982-83. Now, every single one of them has license under the Church of England, practices in an Anglican church. It is a complete deceit to claim that Iwerne was not Anglican. I've never claimed it was controlled centrally. I've never claimed it was controlled by the Church of England, but it was without a shadow of a doubt populated by Church of England bishops, Church of England clergy. The picture in Andrew's book of the Iwerne brochure in 1982 has Lord Coggan as one of the referees, former Archbishop of Canterbury. It is a complete deceit to claim it was not Anglican.
And because you, in a way, you've been banging on the door and it hasn't opened, does that make your suffering worse, Graham?
We are blanked throughout. I mean, Justin Welby, it is 5 years since the story broke on Channel 4. It's actually 8 years since he was told, and he has refused to meet us. We have met him once for 1 hour in a very truncated meeting. And it is that attitude towards victims that makes actually this whole period a lot more difficult.
Andrew, Graham, thank you. And everyone here is saying they really appreciate the fact you're here and that you've exactly, J.A. Stein and others clapping. Thank you so much. Stay here, obviously. But Andrew, I'm trying to work out, you would think the church could do something really quickly on this. Okay, the guy's dead. But why are they not doing it? Is it because they're going to end up having to expel 40 vicars or something?
It may be. I mean, the Iwerne, as Graham says, it would be a nonsense to say that Iwerne was not deeply, deeply entrenched in Anglicanism, and power goes with that. You know, there are a number of bishops who are Iwerne alumni, current bishops, but it's a symptom of the way that the Church of England has really struggled to handle the whole business of safeguarding over the last 10 years. It's come to see victims and disclosures by victims as a problem to it, and so you end up with this kind of adversarial relationship between the church and the victims of abuse. It's also fair to say that the Church of England's leadership in terms of safeguarding is chaotic, and has been really chaotic and continues to be so. But I desperately want the church not to think of victims as problems, but to understand their trauma and their need for relationship and their need for healing. Every one of these victims and every one of the victims of abuse in the Church of England has in common with every vicar and bishop and layperson in the land that somewhere along the line they've had an encounter with Christian faith, and that's been damaged and broken. And I don't understand why the church doesn't want to work at healing that, at repairing it. Is it a fear of the cost or the reputational damage? I genuinely don't understand, but it's truly chaotic at the moment.
Jeremy, can I just kick
Oh, yes,
kick in?
of course, yeah.
We trusted someone to an extraordinary extent. We put them up on a pedestal and he grossly abused that trust. And many of the victims have just got really bad trust issues. We find it really difficult to trust people, have done all our lives. And one of my problems in the last 5 years is that you expect people to behave in a certain way. You put people into a position where you think they're going to do things in a certain way. And the response of the Church of England and senior clerics over the last 5 years has yet again betrayed my trust in the way they might have responded to us. And the silence and the blanking and the diversionary tactics just let us down again and again. And whatever your background is, business or law, whatever, you have expectations of sort of professional standards and human and Christian standards, and you get let down again and again.
Thank you.
That's me done. Sorry.
No, not at all. Will has questions. I know you've sent some questions to Will, which he can pass on to me. And there's a lot of questions coming in. The Makin report comes up a lot. Is that the one that's coming?
Yeah. I mean, bizarrely, the Church of England took a very long time to decide to have an inquiry, to have a report. And in fact, there are now 6 separate inquiries, bizarrely. The Church of England's report, the Winchester College report, the Titus Trust report, the Scripture Union, and the 6 separate inquiries, which is incredibly difficult for victims to be asked to give evidence over and over again in these different contexts. The Church of England's report is sometimes known as the Makin report. It was commissioned eventually after John Smyth died, and was promised to take 9 months. And so far, I think Graham will tell us it's been 27 months or something.
On Monday, it'll be 27 months. So 3 times as long as meant to. We have no date for its publication, but sometime back into next year would be my best guess.
And of course, it's quite a limited inquiry in itself, because it's the Macon inquiry is only there to ascertain whether the Church of England did what it should have done, which is only one of many questions. You know, it doesn't touch what happened in Africa. It doesn't touch a whole load of things in this awful story. So, you know, the Macon inquiry is chugging along, and as Graham says, probably sometime back end of next year it will come out. It's not been asked to make recommendations. It doesn't have any statutory force. It doesn't. Yeah, it's doing its job, and I'm happy to cooperate with it, of course.
I hear you. And there's been Will's going to send me some questions. There, one of them is whether I think I know the answer is whether the church has thanked you for your work on this, Andrew.
Can I go in first? I don't think that anyone from the church in any position with any collar turned around has thanked me for coming forward in 2012 and bringing this to attention. No one yet has thanked me. Over to you, Andrew.
And that's what really matters. What matters is how the church has treated victims and survivors. I don't really expect to be thanked. I suppose, in a sense, there is a sense in which I have, you know, pulled out the church's dirty linen.
Well, you've done the report for them. I mean, with the, you know, you don't have to say it yourself. You've done the work of about 10 people on that book. So you know, they just need to read the book and they got it. But then what they do about it, I don't know.
Yeah, I would love to see action from the church. You know, we know, and we have told the Church of England about a large number of people, including 6 serving bishops, who have known about this. 6 serving bishops have known about this since 2013, and a great many more clergy have known about this since 1982. I would love to see the church take some decisive action on that. We were given a promise, actually, when Justin Welby had an online meeting with a number of victims 6 months ago. He said, we will investigate every person who knew about this but didn't come forward. Haven't seen any action on that at all. So, you know, rather than thanks, I'd love to see some decisive action from the church.
There's a question here. I'm not sure who it's from, but it comes to me via Will. It says, what evidence have you seen that the Church of England will enact genuine cultural changes that will mitigate against abuse of this kind happening again?
You know, the Church of England has worked very hard the last few years at preventative safeguarding. It puts people through a lot of training courses. It raises the question about it wants to be a safe church for children and young people. And in a very complicated organisation, I think the church has done quite a lot on its preventative safeguarding. Where it's failed and continues to fail hopelessly is in how it deals with things that go wrong, how it deals with people who are victims. Because for all the preventative work you do, things will go wrong. People will be abused, as in any organisation. And the church, you know, there are some really basic steps that the church needs to take to make that work. At the moment, I mean, I now, out of this has become a strange vocation that I never sought. I now spend a lot of time, most of my time, with victims and survivors of abuse in churches. And their universal experience is that their treatment at the hands of the church is as bad, many say as bad as the original abuse. Now that seems extraordinary to me, that the church should go on harming people who have been harmed by its members or its leaders. We must get a grip on that. I say we, the church, must get a grip on that.
There's a great question that's come in about the leaders at Iwerne Camps and the fact that they're all from public schools. Now, I was brought up in a very sort of evangelical middle class home. And the reason your book really resonated was I absolutely can see the culture there. I completely understand where that comes from. And I see that there's a certain type of waspy, sort of white middle class male top public school person who just has that, or had that kind of aura in these circles. But you'd think in the church that shouldn't count for as much as it seems to.
Well, it's a very strange elitist sort of, it must come from it comes from the theology, and it comes from the culture. And that's why, you know, it's not just John Smyth, but a number of people within that network have gone on to be abusers. I mean, I'm up to 6 or 7 that I could name, but I won't. Leaders from that network who are known to be abusive. There must be something about the culture of the network that is doing that. I think there are hard questions to be asked about whether that kind of elitism has any place in the Christian faith anyway, whether an organization that's set up to cherry pick, you know, what they understand to be the best of the best, is something that Jesus of Nazareth would have much time for. I also think there, to be fair, if you saw my postcards, my post bag since the book has come out, it doesn't seem to work terribly well, because I've had lots of contact from people who have lost their faith as a result of their experiences in the Iwerne network. So something's going wrong there for them.
There's a great question here from another Jeremy, and it's about Smyth. And actually, this is the one thing I sort of wanted from your book, and I felt I didn't get, but I think you probably didn't want to guess. Where did this evil come from in him? What made him the sadist he was?
I'm not a psychologist, and I don't want to make too simple jumps on that. I mean, where does that kind of behavior come from? It's about a narcissistic personality plus an opportunity. And there's no doubt that he had a narcissistic personality. I mean, I don't want to kind of second guess things about his own experience or his own family background. There are some things I know about that kind of might lend themselves to it, but I don't want to turn into a cod psychologist. What I do know is that people who abuse are not passive. They don't hang around waiting for victims to come their way. They look out for and they create opportunities. They look out for cultures in which abuse can happen. And so the church has to be very careful. Not just, the church can't afford to just sit around and hope things will be all right, and you know, hope nobody trips over the stonework. There are abusers who see the church as a very fertile ground for their abuse, and a part of the church's preventative safeguarding needs to be to look at that, and the church and the Titus Trust and the Iwerne network need to look at themselves and say, what is it about this culture that we've created that lends itself to abusers and makes their work possible, makes their work easier?
And I mean, I'm not familiar really with the Wimbledon case of Jonathan Fletcher. I just know he was a sort of one of those evangelical superstars. His name comes up in the book a heck of a lot, along with his brother David. And I don't know whether David's still alive, but that's, I suppose, a sign that there was more offending, if I can put it like that, than just Smyth.
Yeah, I mean, amongst that list of numerous abusers associated with the network, Jonathan Fletcher is high up there, and is one that we now know about, because although I knew when I started looking at John Smyth, many people said to me, if you're interested in John Smyth, you probably ought to be asking questions about Jonathan Fletcher. It just took me a little bit longer to get that story into a shape that it could be safely brought into the public domain. But yeah, Jonathan Fletcher attended, I think, pretty much every Iwerne camp for 45 years. Never had a formal role, although his brother was the senior leader of the camps, and then went on to be the chair of it. So Jonathan Fletcher was deeply involved in it, and we know at the time that although his style of abuse, his chosen practice, was a bit different, it was very comparable in terms of kind of bullying. It's the creation of, there's something about creating these big magisterial leaders who everybody has to bow down to and respect, and every word they say has to be heeded. And so, you know, and particularly if you're a powerful leader like Jonathan Fletcher, who can allocate people to churches or kind of ruin people's careers. I've had people ring me and say, Jonathan Fletcher blocked my career, ended my career in the church. He was a kingmaker. Those powerful people, they have no place, surely, in the church.
I should ask you about a criticism, Andrew, that your book outs somebody who was a victim, but you didn't ask them whether they could be outed. What is the background to that?
There was, I mean, I've been very careful throughout the book to, as you've probably seen, to disguise the identities of people who were victims of abuse, whose names were not in the public domain. There is one person who was very central to the story, whose name was very much in the public domain. He was, everybody I spoke to knew that he was a victim of abuse by John Smyth, but he has, shall we say, a complicated place in the story, in that he could and probably should have done very much more to stop John Smyth. Now, that's not my reason for naming him. My reason for naming him is that his name was very much in the public domain already. He'd spoken to other journalists, plural. I knew that his family knew about his abuse. I knew that many other people in the network knew about it. So it was already public. You might ask why I didn't go and ask. The reason for that is twofold. One is that I was able to get first-hand accounts, and so you'll see if you look at the book that everything that is said about him is said in his own words. So at that level, I didn't need to go and speak to him. But I was also wary of going and speaking to him, because in the past, every time this has come up, he has taken the information straight back into the Iwerne network. And I felt like if I spoke to him too far in advance, then doors were going to close all over the place, and I would never get to the bottom of this.
Okay.
It's painful. I mean, it's painful.
I understand. I hear you. I just felt I need to ask that question. I'm conscious we're almost at the end, and I'm gosh, opening up microphones and having people speak will give us another hour, I think. Your questions have been brilliant, but I think I should finish with Graham, shouldn't I? Because that's in a way how it starts. And Graham, I mean, it's all still so present in your life, this, isn't it?
Jeremy, I have long since forgotten about Smyth. I couldn't care where he is, rotting in his whatever grave. I don't care about that anymore. And actually, my mind has managed to divorce the abuse, and I actually can't remember that much about it. That's in the past. What justice for me has been is the telling of the story. I just wanted people to know what happened to me, to others. I referred earlier to the church's response. I wanted to make sure everyone was okay, everyone had the support they wanted, because not in 35 years since the Ruston report has ever anyone re-contacted me and said, you know what happened all those years ago, are you still okay? Now I just wanted the story told. I want a few people held to account, and I think Andrew's done that very well. We have our telling of the story. There'll be bits from Titus and bits from Scripture Union and bits from Macon, but the story in its totality is now told, and I'm very pleased about that.
Well, I mean, I couldn't recommend this book highly enough. It's painful, but a really important thing to read. And Graham, thank you for joining us. And Andrew, thank you for writing this. Congratulations is the wrong word, but my goodness, the work in this. And thanks for talking to us tonight. Will, I'll hand back to you if I may.
Jeremy, thanks very much. Andrew, and thanks to everyone for turning out tonight. I think that was a very thorough discussion based around a lot of the issues that the book has raised. And yeah, as I said in the intro, really, I can only implore people to buy, read, and take heed of it. It's a powerful and well, a book that really needed to be published as far as we're concerned, and I think a lot of others too. So that's all really there is to say. So thank you so much to Andrew and Jeremy again, and Graham for your contributions, invaluable and extremely brave too. And all that remains to say is if you haven't bought the book or read it yet, find a copy. It's absolutely necessary to do so, I think. And again, and have a great evening.